I work at this small retail store in a strip mall just outside of Nashville. It's nothing fancy, just one of those places that sells a bit of everything. We close at 10 p.m. and usually there's a couple of us there to lock up. But that night it was just me. My coworker Michelle had been on the earlier shift and she was supposed to leave around 6 p.m. It was a pretty quiet night. We had a few customers come in, but by 9:30 the place was dead. I was just counting down the minutes, ready to go home and unwind. As I was straightening up the shelves, I happened to glance out the front windows and noticed Michelle's car still parked in the lot. It was this beat-up old Honda Civic that you'd recognize anywhere. At first, I thought maybe she had car trouble or something, but then I remembered she left hours ago. I figured she might have gotten a ride from someone and just left her car there, but it bugged me, Something about it just didn't sit right. So I finished closing up the store, made sure everything was locked and secure, and decided to take a quick look inside to see if maybe she was hanging around for some reason. When I got to the back office, the light was still on. That was weird because Michelle was always meticulous about turning off lights and locking doors. She was kind of a by-the-book type, always following the rules. I pushed open the door and there it was, her phone and keys sitting right on the desk. Her purse was on the floor next to the chair. Now, this freaked me out a bit. Who leaves their phone and keys behind? I picked up her phone and saw she had a bunch of missed calls and texts from her boyfriend, asking where she was. I tried calling her boyfriend to see if he'd heard from her, but he was just as clueless as I was. At this point, I'm really starting to worry. It's late and the store is empty. The whole place suddenly felt a lot creepier. I decided to check the security cameras, thinking maybe I could see what time she left or if something happened. The footage showed her leaving around 6:15, like she was supposed to. She walked out the front door and that was it. No sign of anyone else around her, nothing unusual. But the weird thing was, her car was still there. She never came back inside, at least not through the front. Feeling a bit like I was in one of those horror movies, I decided to check the back entrance. It's one of those heavy metal doors that locks automatically when it closes, and it was still locked from the inside. I checked the storage room, the bathroom, everywhere I could think of. There was absolutely no sign of her. I called my manager and explained the situation. She sounded worried too and told me to wait there while she drove over. So there I was, sitting alone in this empty store with only the hum of the fluorescent lights. Every little noise made me jump. When my manager finally arrived, we did another thorough search of the place to see if there was something or a clue we were missing. Still nothing. We ended up calling the police. They came, took our statements, and did their own search. But they didn't find anything either. Michelle had just vanished. The next few days were a blur. The police interviewed everyone, checked the security footage again, and even searched the surrounding area. But there was no trace of her. It was like she just disappeared into thin air. I couldn't get it out of my head. I kept replaying that night over and over, wondering if I'd missed something. The store didn't feel the same after that. Every time I closed up, I'd get this uneasy feeling like someone was watching me. I wasn't the only one either. Some of the other employees started saying the place felt off, that they'd hear weird noises when no one else was around. One night, about a month after Michelle disappeared, I was closing up again. I had just finished locking the front door when I heard this faint sound coming from the back of the store. My heart was pounding as I walked toward the noise. It was coming from the back door. I quietly walked up to it and heard light tapping on the door. I just backed away because there was no way I was going to open that door up to see what was making that noise. After a few minutes, the noise just stopped. I quickly ran back to the front of the store. I locked the front door and bolted to my car. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. I sat in my car looking around the parking lot for a couple of minutes, trying to calm down before I drove home. The next day, I called in sick. I couldn't face going back there. Michelle was still missing and no one had any answers. The police were still looking, but the case had gone cold. Life went on, but not for me. I ended up quitting a few weeks later. I couldn't deal with the constant feeling of fear and anxiety every time I stepped into that store. It's been a few months now, and I still can't shake the feeling that something terrible happened to Michelle. I don't know if I'll ever get over what happened. Maybe I'll never know the truth. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night, and I'll never stop wondering what really happened to Michelle. This happened to me on a rainy night last October, driving down Route 66 in the middle of nowhere. It's a night I can't shake, no matter how hard I try. I'd been driving for hours, the rain coming down like crazy, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I was on my way to Albuquerque from Oklahoma City, planning to crash at a cheap motel off I-40 before finishing the drive the next day. The constant pounding of the rain on my windshield was almost hypnotic, and I was just starting to feel the weight of exhaustion setting in when I saw him. He was standing on the shoulder, drenched to the bone, thumb out, and a desperate look on his face. Now, I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers. You hear too many horror stories. But something about this guy made me pull over. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was just the thought of leaving someone out there in the middle of nowhere. Whatever it was, I slowed to a stop and rolled down the passenger side window. "Need a ride?" I called out. The guy's face lit up and he jogged over, water streaming off his jacket. "Man, you don't know how much I appreciate this," he said, his voice shaky from the cold. "I've been out here for hours." I unlocked the door and he climbed in, bringing a blast of cold, wet air with him. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and a scruffy beard. His clothes were soaked, and he shivered as he buckled his seatbelt. "Thanks, man," he said again, rubbing his hands together. "Name's Jake." "Dave," I replied, pulling back out onto the road. "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere but here," Jake said with a nervous laugh. "Just need to get away." I glanced over at him, eyebrows raised. Get away from what? Jake hesitated, staring out the window at the rain. "It's a long story," he said finally, "but let's just say I'm in a bit of trouble." I didn't press him for details. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that everyone's got their own problems, and sometimes it's best not to dig too deep. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers and the drumming of the rain. After a few miles, Jake started to relax a bit. He asked where I was headed, and we made small talk about the weather, the state of the roads, and how much we both hated driving in the rain. But every now and then I'd catch him glancing nervously over his shoulder, like he was expecting someone to be following us. "Everything okay?" I finally asked, unable to ignore the tension any longer. Jake jumped, then forced a laugh. Yeah, it's fine. Just, paranoid, I guess." "Paranoid about what?" I pressed, starting to feel a little uneasy myself. Jake ran a hand through his wet hair, sighing. "All right, look, I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm running from someone dangerous." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my mind racing. What kind of dangerous? "The kind that doesn't stop until they find you," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The kind that'll do whatever it takes to get what they want." At this point, I was starting to feel like I was in a sketchy situation. I'd seen enough movies to know where this was going, and it wasn't anywhere good. But we were in the middle of nowhere, and kicking him out in the rain didn't seem like an option. "Who is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who are you running from?" Jake hesitated again, then looked me straight in the eye. "A guy named Carter. Let's say he's just not someone you want to mess with. I got mixed up in some bad stuff and now he's after me." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This was bad. Really bad. "What kind of stuff?" Jake shook his head. "It's better if you don't know. Trust me." We drove in silence for a while. The tension in the car was crazy. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every muscle in my body tensed. This guy had brought a whole heap of trouble into my car, and now I was stuck in the middle of it. As we drove, Jake's paranoia seemed to grow. He kept glancing out the back window, his leg bouncing nervously. He'd jump at every passing car and would constantly look around nervously. Honestly, he was starting to freak me out, like a lot. "Hey man, you need to calm down," I said finally, trying to keep my own fear in check. "We're gonna get through this, alright? Just tell me what I can do to help." Jake looked at me, his eyes wide and desperate. "Just keep driving. Don't stop for anything. We need to get as far away as possible." I nodded, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I could feel the fear radiating off him, and it was starting to seep into me. Every mile felt like a lifetime, the rain pounding down relentlessly. We passed through small towns, their lights barely visible through the downpour. Gas stations and restaurants flickered by, but I felt too scared to stop. Jake was a bundle of nerves, and I wasn't about to take any chances. After about an hour, we finally hit a stretch of highway with no other cars in sight. The road was dark and empty, the only light coming from my headlights cutting through the rain. Jake seemed to relax a bit, sinking back into his seat with a sigh. "Thanks, man," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "You don't know what this means to me." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. This was way beyond anything I'd ever dealt with, and I was starting to feel in over my head. And then, out of nowhere, a car appeared behind us, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Jake tensed up immediately, his eyes wide with fear. "Oh man, that's him," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That's Carter." My heart jumped, and I pressed down on the gas, the engine roaring up as we sped up. The car behind us matched our speed, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. "What do we do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Just keep driving," Jake said, his voice shaking. "Don't let him catch us." I nodded and kept going. The rain was coming down harder now, making it almost impossible to see. I could barely make out the lines on the road. The car behind us kept gaining, its headlights blinding. I could feel the fear rising in me, every instinct screaming at me to get away, but there was nowhere to go, no way to escape. And then, without warning, the car switched to the lane next to me, accelerated hard and passed me. The car then merged back into my lane after passing us. We both sat there just watching the taillights pulling away from us, realizing that that wasn't Carter. It wasn't the guy that Jake was so paranoid about. It was just another car traveling on the highway like us, but I guess we were just going too slow for them. Jake laughed nervously and looked over at me. "Well, I guess that wasn't Carter." I could feel my heart pumping from the adrenaline rush. I was so freaked out at this whole situation. At this point, I just couldn't be in the car with this guy anymore. There was an exit coming up with a gas station, and it was my opportunity to drop him off somewhere safe. "I need to get gas at this next exit, and I think it's best if I drop you off there." "Sure, man, I understand. I just appreciate you picking me up out of that rain," Jake said with gratitude and understanding. My heart was still pounding as we took the exit. I pulled into the gas station and up to the gas pump. We both got out and Jake looked over at me. "Thanks, man. I really do appreciate it. I didn't mean to get you caught up in my business. You really saved me out there, though." I nodded and just said, "No problem, and good luck." After getting gas, I got back onto the road as fast as possible. I could see Jake standing in front of the gas station mart in my rearview mirror as I drove away, the rain pounding down on the roof of the car. I could feel the cold air seeping in, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving me drained and exhausted. I never saw him again. I don't know what happened to him, if he ever managed to escape that guy, but that night haunts me, a dark shadow in my memory. Every time I drive down that highway, I can feel the fear creeping back in. It's a night I can't shake, no matter how hard I try. It was a chilly Wednesday evening in early October when it first happened. I was in my house on the north side of Chicago near Lincoln Square when I heard the doorbell ring. I hadn't ordered anything and I wasn't expecting any visitors. My first thought was that it was some kind of mistake. I opened the door to find a young guy in a red Grubhub jacket holding a large paper bag. His face was partially hidden behind a cloth face mask, but I could see his friendly eyes as he greeted me. "Food delivery for you," he said, handing me the bag. "I didn't order any food," I replied, confused. "This is the address," he insisted, showing me his phone. Indeed, it had my name and address on it, clear as day. After a moment of hesitation, I accepted the bag, thinking perhaps one of my friends had sent it as a surprise. The driver nodded and left without another word. I brought the bag inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. Opening it, I found an assortment of dishes from a local Thai restaurant called Sticky Rice, which I loved. Despite my initial hesitation, the aroma was tempting. Maybe it was a mix-up, but since it was here, I decided to enjoy it. The next evening, around the same time, the doorbell rang again. I was working on my laptop, finishing up some reports for my job at a local marketing firm. The interruption startled me, and I went to answer the door, wondering if it could be another unexpected delivery. To my surprise, it was the same Grubhub driver holding another bag of food. "Food delivery for you?" he repeated, extending the bag towards me. "This has to be a mistake," I said, feeling a little uncomfortable at this point. "I didn't order anything." He just shrugged. "This is the address on the order," he replied. I took the bag reluctantly. "Who's ordering this?" I asked, trying to get more information. "I'm just the driver," he said, then turned and walked away before I could ask any more questions. This time, the food was from Pequod's Pizza, a popular spot in Lincoln Park. Again, it was a meal I loved, which made the situation even stranger. I felt a chill run down the back of my neck. Someone knew my tastes and was sending me food, but who? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of the growing anxiety. I decided to check the security cameras I had installed around my house. Living in the city, I'd always felt safer with them in place. I rewound the footage to the time of the delivery and watched as the driver approached my door, dropped off the food, and then walked away. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I saw him pause at the end of the driveway and turn back. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at my house. Then he walked to the side of the house, disappearing from the camera's view. My heart started pounding as I fast-forwarded the footage. About 10 minutes later, he reappeared, got into his car, and drove away. Who was this guy, and what the heck was he doing lurking around my house? The following evening, I was on edge. I'd decided not to accept any more deliveries, no matter what. When the doorbell rang again, I felt a surge of anxiety. Peering through the peephole, I saw the same driver standing there, another bag of food in his hands. This time, I didn't open the door. I watched him through the peephole, hoping he would just leave, but he didn't. He rang the bell again, then knocked. My heart was racing and my palms were sweaty. I felt trapped, not knowing what to do. After what felt like forever, he finally set the bag down and walked away. I waited, holding my breath, until I was sure he was gone. Then I checked the cameras again. Just like before, he lingered near the house, walking around the side where there were no cameras. This was no coincidence. It seemed like he was casing my home. The next morning, I went to the local police station that was closest to me. I told the officer at the desk about the deliveries and the driver's strange behavior. She took down my information and said they would look into it, but I could tell she thought it was just a misunderstanding or something. Feeling frustrated, I decided to contact Grubhub directly. I explained the situation to their customer service, but they assured me that all their drivers underwent background checks and that they would investigate the matter internally. It wasn't much comfort. That weekend, I had a security company come out and install additional cameras around the house, covering the blind spots. I also changed the locks, just in case. I was determined to protect myself, but the feeling of being watched just lingered. I told my friends about what was happening, and they offered their support. My best friend Emma even offered to stay with me for a few days, which I gladly accepted. Having someone else in the house made me feel a bit safer. With Emma there, I finally felt like I could relax a little, but the peace didn't last long. One night, we decided to watch a movie to take our minds off things. Halfway through, I got up to make some popcorn in the kitchen and noticed something odd on the counter tucked behind the back of the microwave. It was a small black device, no bigger than a matchbox. I picked it up, examining it closely. It had a small lens on one side. It was a hidden camera. My heart sank as I realized that someone had been watching me inside my own home. I called the police immediately, and they came to investigate. They searched the house thoroughly and found 2 more cameras, one in the living room and another in my bedroom. They collected the evidence and assured me they would do everything they could to find out who was responsible. Even with the extra security measures and the police involved, I couldn't stop feeling vulnerable. Every creak or weird noise made me jump, and I could barely sleep. Emma tried to comfort me, but the fear was overwhelming. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard a noise outside. It was a soft, shuffling sound like someone walking on gravel. I froze, straining to hear. The sound grew louder and closer. I reached for my phone, ready to call 911, when suddenly it stopped. The next day, I decided I couldn't live in fear any longer. I was going to confront this driver and find out what he wanted. I asked Emma to stay inside and watch the cameras while I waited outside at the time the deliveries usually came. Sure enough, around 8 p.m., the familiar red jacket appeared. He parked his car a little way down the street and walked towards my house with another bag of food. My heart was jumping out of my chest as I stepped out to meet him. "What do you want?" I demanded, standing my ground. He looked surprised, but didn't say anything. Instead, he tried to hand me the bag. "Stop sending me food," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "And stop hanging around my house. I've called the police." For a moment, he just stood there, staring at me. Then, without a word, he turned around and walked back to his car. I watched him drive away as I stood there with my legs trembling. A few days later, I received a call from the police. They had identified the driver and brought him in for questioning. It turned out he wasn't a real Grubhub employee. He had been using a fake uniform and stolen bags to gain access to people's homes. He admitted to breaking in, planting the cameras and sending the food as a way to study his targets before breaking in. The police found more evidence at his apartment, linking him to several other break-ins in the area. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of breaking and entering, burglary, and harassment. It took me a long time to feel safe again. I upgraded my security system even further and started attending self-defense classes. I never thought something like food being delivered to my house would change my life forever, but it did. You know, I've never really been one to buy into all those creepy stories you hear about late night encounters and deserted places. I mean, sure, they're scary, but they always seem like something that happens to other people. But after what happened to me a few months ago, I have a whole new appreciation for those stories. It all went down one late evening in November, and I still get chills thinking about it. I work at an advertising firm downtown. It's a decent gig, but the hours can be brutal. That particular night, I was wrapping up a project that had me in the office way past normal hours. By the time I finally called it quits, it was close to 11 p.m. The office was practically empty except for a few night owls in the IT department who were still plugging away at their keyboards. I gathered my things, threw on my coat, and headed out. My car was parked in the underground garage beneath the building, a place that's usually busy during the day but turns into a ghost town at night. As soon as the elevator doors opened to the parking level, I felt that familiar chill of stepping into an empty space. The bright fluorescent lights put off creepy shadows and every little sound seemed amplified. The garage was mostly empty, except for a few scattered cars. I could see my car parked a little ways off and, next to it, a solid white van. It wasn't uncommon to see these types of vans in the city, but something about this one felt off. It was parked unusually close to my car, which made me feel super uncomfortable. I hesitated for a moment, considering my options. There was an elevator behind me and a stairwell to my left, but neither seemed particularly appealing at that moment. Besides, I just wanted to get home, so I started walking towards my car, trying to shake off the nerves I was feeling. As I got closer, I could see that the van's windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. My heart started to race, and I sped up my pace, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. I was maybe 10 feet away when the van's side door suddenly slid open. My heart practically leaped out of my chest. A man jumped out, and before I could react, he lunged at me, grabbing my arm. Pure adrenaline kicked in, and I yanked my arm free and stumbled backward, my keys flying out of my hand. He grabbed at me again, but I managed to duck and twist away, my instincts screaming at me to run. I took off towards the stairwell, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps echoing in the empty garage. I reached the stairwell door, flung it open, and practically threw myself inside. I could barely breathe, and I could hear the guy cussing behind me as I bolted up the stairs. I didn't stop until I reached the lobby level, bursting out of the stairwell and into the empty foyer. I glanced around, desperate for help, but the security desk was empty. I spotted a phone on the wall and sprinted towards it, my hand shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm and steady, a stark contrast to my own panicked voice as I explained what had happened. She told me to stay on the line and that officers were on their way. I huddled in a corner, my back pressed against the wall, eyes looking to the stairwell door every few seconds. It felt like an eternity before I finally heard the distant wail of sirens. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't shake the fear that the man might burst through the door at any second. I clutched the phone like a lifeline. I could feel the pain in my hand from gripping it so tight. When the police arrived, they swept through the building, checking the garage and the surrounding areas. They found my keys near my car, but the van and the man were gone. The officers were kind, reassuring me that they'd do everything they could to find the guy. They took my statement, asking for every detail I could remember. The man's face was a blur in my memory. I just couldn't give them a good description, which made me kind of upset. I described the van as best I could, but without a license plate number, it felt like a long shot. The police escorted me to my car, making sure I was safe before I drove home. That drive felt surreal, the city lights passing by in a haze as I replayed the night's events over and over in my mind. I kept glancing into my rearview mirror, half expecting the van to appear behind me. When I finally reached my apartment, I double-checked all the locks and spent the night on my couch. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the man might come back. I started parking in different garages near my building, trying to vary my routine. I even considered taking time off work. The police followed up a few times, but there were no real leads. The van was a common make and model, the kind you see everywhere. Without more to go on, the case just kind of faded into the background. But for me, it never really went away. Every time I step into a parking garage, I feel that same chill, that same sense of nervousness. I'm hyper aware of my surroundings now, always looking over my shoulder, always on edge. It's exhausting living with that kind of fear, but it's also a reminder of how quickly things can change, how a routine night can turn into a nightmare. Driving alone on the interstate can be a boring experience, but for me, a simple drive turned into a nightmarish experience I'll never forget. It was a warm summer evening in July, and I was driving back to Chicago from a weekend visit to my parents' house in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I had just passed through the small town of Sterling, Illinois, when it happened. The front passenger tire blew out with a loud bang, and my car swerved dangerously before I managed to pull over to the side of the road. My heart was pounding in my chest as I came to a stop on a desolate stretch of highway. I got out of the car to assess the damage. The tire was completely shredded, and there was no way I could drive any further without replacing it. I rummaged through the trunk for the spare tire and jack, but I quickly realized that the spare tire was also flat. I just couldn't believe my bad luck. I grabbed my phone from the front of the car and called for roadside assistance. After a brief conversation with the operator, I was told that a tow truck would be dispatched to my location, but it would take at least an hour for it to arrive. I sighed and leaned against the car, watching the sky darken as the sun dipped below the horizon. The highway was eerily quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. As time went on, I became increasingly uneasy. There was something unsettling about being stranded in the middle of nowhere with no one around to help. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through social media on my phone, but the dwindling battery reminded me that I needed to conserve power in case of an emergency. It was then that I saw headlights approaching from the distance. A beat-up old pickup truck slowed down as it neared my car and pulled over to the side of the road. The driver, a man in his late 40s, got out and walked toward me with a friendly smile. "Looks like you could use some help," he said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. I hesitated for a moment before responding, "Yeah, I had a blowout and my spare is flat too. I'm waiting for roadside assistance, but they said it would take about an hour." The man nodded sympathetically. "That's a tough break. I can take a look at it if you want. I've got some tools in the back of my truck." I glanced at his truck, noticing the array of tools and equipment in the bed. It seemed like he knew what he was doing, and I was desperate for help. I decided to trust him, at least for the moment. The man introduced himself as Daniel and got to work examining the damaged tire. He confirmed that the spare was flat and suggested that he could give me a ride to the nearest gas station to get it fixed. "It's about 10 miles up the road," he said. "Shouldn't take long." I was reluctant to leave my car, but Daniel assured me that it would be safe. He seemed genuine, and I didn't want to wait in the dark any longer than necessary. I grabbed my phone, locked the car, and got into the passenger seat of his truck. As we drove, Daniel made small talk, talking about my trip and sharing stories about his life. He seemed like an ordinary guy, and I started to relax a little. However, my sense of nervousness returned when I noticed that we were heading away from the main highway. "Isn't the gas station in the other direction?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a closer one this way," he replied. "Trust me, I know these roads." I didn't have much choice but to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The further we drove, the more remote the area became. The trees were getting thicker and the darkness seemed to close in around us. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel finally pulled into a small, dimly lit gas station. Relief washed over me as I got out of the truck and stretched my legs. Daniel handed me the flat spare tire and pointed me toward the entrance. "I'll wait here," he said. "Go on and get it fixed. I'll stay with the truck." I thanked him and hurried inside. The gas station attendant, a grizzly old man with a cigarette hanging from his lips, barely glanced at me as I explained my situation. He took the tire and disappeared into the back, leaving me alone in the dimly lit store. As I waited, I couldn't help but glance back outside at Daniel's truck. The longer I stood there, the more anxious I became. Something about Daniel's behavior was nagging at me, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. When the attendant finally returned with the repaired tire, I thanked him and paid for the service. As I walked back to the truck, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The bed of Daniel's truck, which had seemed cluttered with tools, also contained several lengths of rope and a large roll of duct tape. A chill ran down my body as I realized the implications. I tried to stay calm as I approached the truck, but my mind was racing with thoughts of how to get out of this situation. I needed to find a way to get back to my car without arousing Daniel's suspicion. Daniel greeted me with a smile as I handed him the repaired tire. "All set?" he asked. "Yeah, thanks for your help," I replied, forcing a smile. "I think I'll just wait for the tow truck to come. I called them and told them to meet me at this location. They should be here soon." Daniel's expression changed, and for a moment I saw something dark and sinister in his eyes. "Nonsense," he said. "I'll take you back to your car. It's no trouble at all." I felt a surge of panic, but tried to keep my voice steady. "Really, it's fine. I appreciate your help, but I can manage from here." Daniel's grip tightened on the tire, and his friendly facade slipped away entirely. "Get in the truck," he said, his voice cold and commanding. My heart was pounding as I weighed my options. I could try to run, but I doubted I could outrun him. I needed to outsmart him. "Okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "Let me just grab something from the store real quick. I'll be right back." Daniel narrowed his eyes but nodded. "Make it quick." I turned and walked back into the gas station, my mind racing. I needed to find a way to alert someone, anyone, to my situation. As I entered the store, I saw the attendant watching me with a curious expression. "Can I use your phone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mine's dead and I need to make a quick call." The attendant shrugged and handed me an old battered phone. I dialed 911, my hands shaking as I explained my situation in a hushed voice. The operator assured me that help was on the way and advised me to stay inside the store until they arrived. I hung up the phone and turned to the attendant, who was still watching me with a curious expression. "I think I'm in trouble," I said quietly. "Can you keep an eye on that guy outside? He's acting really weird." The attendant's expression hardened, and he nodded. "Stay here," he said. "I'll take care of it." I watched as the attendant walked outside and confronted Daniel. There was a tense exchange of words, but I couldn't hear what was being said. Moments later, Daniel got back into his truck and sped off into the night. Relief washed over me as I realized that I was safe, at least for the moment. The police arrived shortly after, and I gave them a detailed account of what had happened. They assured me that they would investigate and escorted me back to my car with my newly repaired tire. As I drove the rest of the way home, I couldn't shake the feeling of that fear I felt. I kept replaying the events of the night in my mind, wondering what might have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. The experience left me shaken, but it also taught me a valuable lesson about trusting my instincts and being cautious when accepting help from strangers. It was a late Friday night, and I was starving. I had spent the entire evening catching up on work, barely noticing the time. The kitchen was void of anything edible, and the thought of cooking was exhausting, so I did what any sensible person would do. I ordered food delivery. I live alone in a small, quiet neighborhood. It's the kind of place where you know your neighbors by name and everyone looks out for each other. I always felt safe there, which is probably why I let my guard down that night. The delivery app showed that the driver, Mark, was just a few minutes away. I felt a small sense of relief, anticipating the warm meal that would soon be in my hands. As the car pulled up, I noticed it was a beat-up sedan with dents and scratches, but I didn't think much of it. People work hard, and not everyone can afford a new car. When I opened the door, Mark stood there holding my food. He looked like an average guy in his early 30s, with a scruffy beard and a worn-out baseball cap. He handed me the bag with a friendly smile, and I thanked him, ready to close the door and enjoy my dinner. "Excuse me," he said just as I was about to shut the door. "Do you mind if I use your bathroom? It's been a long shift and I really need to go." I felt slightly uncomfortable letting a stranger into my house, even just to use the bathroom, but I also didn't want to be rude. He seemed harmless enough, and it was just a quick trip to the bathroom. "Sure, it's right down the hall," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He nodded gratefully and hurried past me. As I waited for him to finish, I started unpacking my food on the kitchen counter. I couldn't shake the weird feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. My eyes kept looking to the hallway, listening for any unusual sounds. Finally, he emerged from the hallway. "Thank you so much," he said with the same friendly smile. "I really appreciate it." "No problem," I replied, forcing a smile. "Have a good night." He nodded and left, closing the door behind him. I locked it immediately and double-checked to make sure it was secure. The uneasy feeling lingered, but I brushed it off, convincing myself I was being paranoid. Hours later, I suddenly woke up. My heart was pounding, and for a moment, I couldn't figure out why. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the back of the house. My first thought was that it was an animal, but the noise was too intentional. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The scratching continued, followed by a soft thud. It sounded like someone was trying to break in. Panic surged through me as I grabbed my phone and crept out of bed. I moved as quietly as possible, not wanting to alert whoever was outside. As I reached the living room, I peeked through the curtains. I was frozen with fear when I saw the silhouette of a man at the back door. It was Mark, the delivery driver. He was using a crowbar to try and force the door open. My hands trembled as I dialed 911, praying they would answer quickly. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice came through the line. Someone is trying to break into my house, I whispered urgently. It's the DoorDash delivery driver from earlier. He's at my back door right now. Stay on the line with me, the operator instructed. Police are on their way. Do you have a safe place to hide? I glanced around, trying to think. The basement. I could hide there until the police arrived. I moved as quietly as possible, making my way to the basement door. Just as I reached it, I heard the back door splinter and crack. He was getting in. I hurried down the basement stairs, quietly closing the door behind me. I huddled in a dark corner, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The operator stayed on the line, reassuring me that help was on the way. I listened to the sounds of Mark moving through my house. I heard footsteps, drawers opening and closing, the sound of things being moved around. It sounded like he was searching for something. Suddenly, the basement door creaked open. My heart stopped. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come down the stairs. I could hear his heavy breathing as he stood at the top, seemingly undecided whether or not to come down. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the tense silence. Mark cursed under his breath and slammed the door shut. I heard him run through the house, then the sound of the back door opening and closing again. The police arrived moments later. They found me in the basement, still clutching my phone, shaking and terrified. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but Mark was long gone. They took my statement and assured me they would do everything they could to find him. The days that followed were a blur of fear and anxiety. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting him to return. The police informed me that they had been patrolling the neighborhood, and my neighbors were all on high alert. Despite their efforts, Mark was never found. Eventually, I moved out of that house, unable to shake the memories of that night. I still get the creeps when I think about it, and I've never let my guard down since. I learned a hard lesson about trust and safety. Some people might call it paranoia, but I call it survival. To this day, I still have nightmares about that night. The thought of how easily things could have gone differently haunts me. I never order food delivery anymore. It's a small price to pay for peace of mind. I've got a story for you, one that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I used to work the night shift at a convenience store in a small town in Indiana. You know the kind, open 24/7, usually quiet after 10 p.m., except for the occasional late-night customer needing smokes or snacks. This was a couple of years ago, and it was one of those nights when you feel like you're the only person awake in the whole world. So there I am at the register, trying to keep myself awake with endless cups of crappy coffee and a beat-up paperback novel. It was around 1 a.m. when I first noticed him. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just a guy hanging out near the gas pumps, which wasn't that unusual. People sometimes hang around, maybe waiting for a ride or just randomly chilling. But then, I kept seeing him. Every time I glanced at the security monitors, he was still there. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, looking at the store. His face was hidden under the shadow of a hoodie, but I could tell he was staring directly at me through the glass doors. After about an hour, it started to get really creepy. I mean, he wasn't coming in or leaving, just standing there. I could feel him staring at me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself he was probably just some drunk guy who didn't want to go home. But deep down, I was starting to get that gut feeling, the one that tells you something's not right. I decided to take a quick walk around the store, just to check things out. I went to the back room to stock some shelves, and when I came back, he was gone. I felt a bit relieved, thinking maybe he had finally left. But then, as I was restocking the cooler, I saw him again on the security monitor. This time, he was closer, standing near the front of the store. My heart started racing. I didn't want to go outside and confront him, but I couldn't just ignore it either. I quickly locked the front door, something we rarely did, especially during business hours. Then I grabbed the phone and called my boss. I told him what was happening, and he brushed it off, saying it was probably just some harmless drunk guy. He told me to keep the door locked and call the police if he tried to get in. Great. So now I'm stuck in this store, alone, with some creepy guy hanging around outside. I tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't concentrate. Every single noise made me jump. I kept glancing at the monitors, and he was still there, just staring. It was around 3 a.m. when things took a turn for the worse. I was restocking the candy and chips aisle, making sure everything was in order, when I heard a noise. It was faint, but in the silence of the night, it was unmistakable. Someone was rattling the back door. I just froze in place and felt like I was about to freak out. I tiptoed to the back room, trying to be as quiet as possible. The back door had a small window, and through it, I could see the guy. He was trying to pick the lock. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely dial 911. I whispered into the phone, telling the operator that someone was trying to break in. She assured me that officers were on their way and told me to find a place to hide. I ran to the small office that was located behind the checkout counter of the store, locked the door, and crawled under the desk. It felt like forever, just sitting there, waiting, listening to the sounds of someone trying to get in. Then, suddenly, the noise stopped. I didn't know whether he stopped trying to get in or if he actually did get in. Finally, I heard the sirens. When the police arrived, they found him hiding in the back room, armed with a knife. He had somehow managed to actually pick the lock. They arrested him, and I later found out he had a history of mental illness. He also had been previously arrested multiple times for violent offenses. The officers told me I was lucky. If they had been there even a few minutes later, things could have ended very differently. I quit that job the next day. I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me, the way he watched me for hours before making his move. I still have nightmares about it, waking up in a cold sweat, feeling like I'm back in that store, alone in the dead of night with that creep outside. So yeah, that's my story. It's been a few years, but I still can't walk into a convenience store without feeling a little uneasy. Working the night shift seems like such a harmless thing until something like that happens. It was supposed to be just another late night drive. I had been visiting my friend Kaylee, who lived in a small town called Milton, just a couple of hours outside of Boston. The night had been fun, full of laughter and catching up, but as midnight approached, I decided it was time to head back home. I wasn't too worried about the drive. I'd made the trip several times before, but that night, something felt different. The air had a crisp chill to it, typical for early autumn in New England. As I drove through the quiet streets of Milton, the leaves on the trees were just starting to turn shades of orange and red. It was the kind of night that made you appreciate the beauty of the season, but also reminded you of the coming cold. I was cruising along the I-495, the radio turned down low, my mind lost in thoughts about work and life. The night was pitch black, with only the occasional car passing by. Everything was fine until I noticed a sign for an exit I didn't recognize. It read Cobbler's Creek, exit 62A. Curious and feeling a bit adventurous, I decided to take it. I figured it might be a shortcut or at least an interesting detour. As soon as I took the exit, the road became narrower and the surroundings darker. Trees lined either side, their branches forming a canopy that almost blocked out the moonlight. The dense foliage seemed to close in on me, creating an almost tunnel-like effect. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. The road, initially paved, soon turned to gravel, and the crunching sound under my tires added to the eerie atmosphere. I drove on, expecting to find another sign or a turnoff that would lead me back to the main road, but there was nothing. Just endless trees and the faint glow of my headlights slicing through the darkness. The unease that had been a quiet whisper in the back of my mind began to grow louder. The road seemed to stretch on forever with no end in sight. My GPS had lost signal and my phone was down to its last few percent of battery. The uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger. Just as I was considering turning around, I saw it. A car, broken down on the side of the road. It was an old beat-up sedan, its hood propped open as if someone had been working on it. I slowed down, my headlights illuminating the empty vehicle. There was no one around, no lights from a nearby house, no sign of anyone walking, just the car, sitting there in the dark, abandoned. I rolled down my window and called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence. I glanced at my phone, still no signal. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe they had gone to get help, or maybe they were hiding, waiting for someone like me to stop. The whole situation just felt creepy, and I decided it was best to keep moving. I rolled up the window and pressed the gas, my car inching forward. That's when I saw it in my rearview mirror. The lights of the broken down car flickered on. I froze for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The car's engine roared to life, and it pulled onto the road, slowly following me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe they had fixed their car and were also trying to find their way back. But as I picked up speed, so did they. Every turn I made, they followed. The road twisted and turned through the dense forest, and every time I thought I'd lost them, their headlights appeared again in the distance. The sense of fear grew with every passing minute. I needed to get back to the main road, to civilization. I was looking around and searching for any sign that might lead me out of this nightmare. Finally, I saw a dimly lit gas station up ahead. It was old and run down, but it was something. I pulled in pretty fast, my tires sliding on the gravel as I came to a stop. The car behind me slowed down but didn't stop. Instead, it drove past the gas station and continued down the road, disappearing into the night. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The gas station was eerily quiet. The only light came from the flickering light above the entrance. I got out of my car, my hands shaking, and walked inside. The bell above the door jingled, but no one was behind the counter. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No response. I walked to the back of the store, searching for any sign of life. Suddenly, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. I peered through a dusty window and saw the car. It had turned around now and was parked outside of the gas station, its headlights off, but I could see the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat. Panic set in. I needed to get out of there. I rushed back to my car, fumbling with my keys. As I started the engine, the other car's headlights turned on again, blinding me. I slammed the car into reverse, my tires spinning in the gravel, and then sped out of the gas station and back onto the road. I drove on for what felt like an eternity without stopping, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. The car was gone, but the fear lingered. Eventually, I saw familiar signs for the I-495 and made my way back to the main highway. The tension in my body slowly eased as the lights of Boston came into view. When I finally pulled into my driveway, The sun was beginning to rise. I sat in my car for a moment, trying to process what had happened. It felt like a bad dream, but the fear was real. I never did find out who was in that car or what they wanted. All I know is that I'll never take an unknown exit late at night again. I never expected my quiet evening to turn into a night of terror. It started just like any other Friday night. I had come home from work, looking forward to a relaxing weekend. My small house in the suburbs was my sanctuary, a place where I felt safe and at ease. But that sense of security was shattered by a single knock on the door. It was around 8 p.m. and I was in the middle of watching my favorite show when I heard the knock. It wasn't the usual soft knock I got from neighbors or friends. It was firm and deliberate. I paused the show and made my way to the door, wondering who it could be. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a man in a delivery uniform. He held a large brown paper bag that looked like it came from a local Chinese restaurant. The sight of the food made my stomach growl. I hadn't eaten dinner yet.
"Delivery for Sarah?"
he said, glancing down at a slip of paper. My name is not Sarah, so there must have been a mistake. I'm sorry, but I didn't order any food, and my name isn't Sarah, I replied, trying to keep my tone polite. The man frowned and checked the slip again.
"This is 152 Maple Street, right?"
Yes, but I didn't order anything, I repeated, feeling a slight nervousness creep in. He shrugged.
"Sometimes people order food for their friends or family. Maybe it's a surprise. It's already paid for."
That seemed possible. My sister had surprised me with food deliveries before. I decided to take the bag, thinking it might be a kind gesture from her. "Okay, thanks," I said, taking the bag from him. He gave me a strange smile before turning to leave. I closed the door and carried the bag to the kitchen. As I unpacked the food, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The food looked and smelled delicious, but there was no note or message. It was just food. I texted my sister to thank her, but she replied almost immediately, saying she hadn't sent anything. My anxiety grew stronger. If she didn't send it, then who did? I decided not to eat the food. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. I put the food in the fridge and tried to go back to my show, but my mind kept wandering back to the delivery guy and his strange smile. Several hours passed and I eventually went to bed, trying to convince myself that I was overthinking things. But I couldn't fall asleep. Every little noise in the house seemed amplified and my thoughts kept racing. The next morning, I woke up early, still feeling uneasy. I went to the kitchen to make coffee and saw the bag of food sitting in the fridge. I decided to throw it away, just to be safe. As I was about to toss it in the trash, I noticed something odd about the bag. There was a small tear in the side, and through it, I could see a piece of paper. I was definitely curious, so I pulled it out. It was a handwritten note, and what it said made me panic.
"I've been watching you."
My heart pounded in my chest as I read the note over and over again. This was no ordinary delivery. Someone had gone through the trouble of pretending to deliver food just to leave this message. But why? I felt exposed and vulnerable. I immediately checked all the locks on my doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. Then I called the police. An officer arrived within the hour. I showed him the note and explained what had happened. He took it seriously and told me they would definitely look into it, but he also told me there wasn't much they could do without more information. For the next few days, I lived in a state of constant anxiety. Every time I left the house, I felt like I was being watched. A week after the fake delivery, I was coming home from work when I saw the same car parked near my house. It was the same make and model as before, and it filled me with fear. It was still daylight, so I decided to confront the driver. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I couldn't live in fear any longer. I parked my car and walked over to the other vehicle. As I approached, I saw a man sitting inside, staring at me. It was the same man who had delivered the food. My heart raced as I knocked on the car window. He rolled it down and I could see the same strange smile on his face.
"Can I help you?"
He asked, his voice calm and casual. "Why are you watching me?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled softly.
"I'm not watching you. I'm just taking a break."
"From what? Delivering food?" I shot back, my anger rising. He didn't answer. Instead, he started the car and drove away, leaving me standing there, trembling with fear and frustration. I went back inside, feeling more paranoid than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next day, I had security cameras installed around my house, hoping they would deter him or at least capture evidence if he tried anything. But the cameras only made me more anxious. I found myself constantly checking the footage, looking for any sign of him. I barely slept, and when I did, I would awake from nightmares filled with his strange smile and the note that had started it all. About a week later, I woke up to the sound of a notification on my phone. The camera had detected motion in my backyard. I opened the app and watched the live feed, my heart pounding in my chest. There he was, standing in my backyard, staring up at the camera with that same unnerving smile. He waved slowly, as if mocking me, before disappearing into the night. I called the police again and they came to investigate, but by the time they arrived, he was long gone. They found no signs of forced entry and the footage had not been recorded in my app for some reason. There was no evidence that he had been there at all. I felt like I was losing my mind. My once safe and comfortable home had become a prison of fear and paranoia. I didn't know what he wanted or why he was doing this to me, but I knew I couldn't live like this any longer. I decided to stay with my sister for a while, hoping that putting some distance between us would make him stop. But even as I packed my bags, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. A few days after moving in with my sister, I received a call from the police. They had caught him. Apparently, he had been stalking several women in the area, using the guise of a delivery driver to get close to them. One of his other victims had managed to get a clear picture of his license plate, and the police had tracked him down. When they searched his house, they found a collection of notes and photos. He had been watching me for weeks, taking pictures of me as I went about my daily life. The note in the delivery bag was just the beginning of his sick game. Knowing that he was behind bars brought some relief, but the fear and paranoia didn't disappear overnight. I eventually moved back into my house and slowly started to feel safe again, but the experience has changed me. I'm more cautious and more aware of my surroundings. I'll never take my safety for granted again.